Hi, and welcome to the AI Trend Seminar. We're so happy to see such a big crowd. We had a record at signups here at AI Sweden today, so I'm so thankful for everybody joining. My name is Astrid Sjögren, and I will be the moderator of today's event. And normally I work at AI Sweden with small and medium-sized enterprises and helping them figure out AI. With me today, I have Daniel Gillblad, who is the scientific advisor at AI Sweden and also the chief of AI at Recorded Future. Welcome, Daniel.
Thank you so much. Great to be here.
Yes. And today it is harder than ever to predict the future. The development is going at record pace, and especially concerning AI. But we still want to make a bold attempt at doing a little bit of prediction today, and we will have 4 trends lined up for you today. The first one we're going to be talking about is open source large language models, and that is going to be presented by Magnus Sahlgren at AI Sweden. After that, we'll be listening to Sasha Rubin from AWS, who will be talking about AI safety and security. Our third topic of the day is going to be towards autonomy, which will be presented by Patrick Couch from Hewlett Packard Enterprise. And the last speaker of the day is going to be Gardar Björnsson Rova, who is going to talk about AI economics. And Gardar is from the McKinsey Corporation. So we're really looking forward to all our speakers. And at the end of the event, we will round up with a fireside chat. And hopefully we'll be finished with the event around 5 o'clock this afternoon. So Daniel, how come these 4 topics were chosen for this trend seminar?
Yeah, as you say, right, it's very difficult. With the pace and impact that AI is having at the moment, how do you choose a few subjects that might actually be of relevance for not only people within research and development, but also for people thinking about how to deploy this, how to actually make real use of this, and to make sure that we get AI out into society at scale in a responsible manner. But I really do think that in many ways, we can actually back up a little bit, go back to some fundamental trends, some fundamental drivers, and see, so what do these mean now in this context? And I think it's good to at least first revisit what you said, moving at breakneck speed, because it's, I've been working within AI research and development for 25 years by now. I've never seen this kind of pace before. It's become, even if you spend more or less all of your waking hours trying to follow AI development and sort of predict the future, you really cannot have a whole full grip of the field, which is also why this kind of seminar is basically great for people like us who really need to stay on top of these trends and so on.
Yeah, it's mostly for us. I mean,
yeah, it's mostly for us. It's great to hear from the speakers, basically. No, but so if we go back to see what does breakneck pace really mean, I think it's good to remind ourselves that everyone sort of expects now computers to interact like chatbots in a reasonably good way and so on, but it's just a little bit more than a year ago since ChatGPT was introduced, which really took this kind of capability to the forefront. So it's not that long ago. It's only during last year that we've started to see more capable multimodal models that can really incorporate not only text, but vision, speech, etc., and do absolutely amazing things. And if you're trying to predict the future and trying to decide, so where do we go as an organization or a company or a research center and so on, it's a little bit challenging because some of these strategies basically change week by week when there is a release of a new model, when there is a release of a new capability. And for example, during last year, when we started to realize that no, perhaps we do not have to rely on just these kinds of services from certain types of companies and so on, but a lot of AI is still going to be open source and open. So again, going back to the fundamentals, one of these things that I think we should reflect on, and I think our topics reflect, is the fact that working with AI today is very different from working with AI 5 years ago, or definitely 10 or 15 years ago. We are no longer really necessarily reinventing the wheel again and again and again. collecting data, training something, for example, with machine learning for a very, very specific purpose, we can actually leverage these foundational models that have great capacities on things that the developers didn't really think about even when they actually developed them. So the pace of development is so much quicker now. And for me also as a practitioner, nothing has really changed the way I work as much as this kind of access. It's so much quicker to download models, test, deploy, etc., etc. And the open source movement and the fact that we are sharing these artifacts, models, benchmarks, data sets, etc., etc., it's really a super strong driver for innovation that we're seeing across the whole industry. It gives access to not only sophisticated models, but also ways of experimenting and innovating and developing, basically. So I think that this trend of looking at AI, that's something that both a service in big companies, but also driven by these common artifacts that we all reuse again and again, a little bit like we've reused open source in the computer industry for a long time now, is super interesting. So of course we're going to talk about that. And these types of models that we share again and again, they have really introduced some really great new capabilities. And of course, it's a lot of stuff, but we are so much better now at interpreting the world. Text, for example, but also vision and video, sound. And we're going to move on to other modalities such as graphs, such as structured data, and so on, with easy access to general models. So it's so easy now to get a really good understanding for what, for example, a text means, how to summarize it, etc., etc. Things that we couldn't really do just a few years ago. So interpretation is so much better. Interaction with humans is, of course, magnificently much better compared to just a couple of years ago. We can now have natural interfaces with text and so on, where we can have much more natural conversations and sort of specify, let's not necessarily call it goals, but at least questions and so on that are much more open and much more human. These systems are becoming way more human. And we're quickly moving away from just text as a modality to other modalities as well, as speech, etc., etc. So this kind of interaction is also super interesting to see. So if we put all these things together, basically, we can definitely see that some of the things that we discussed within research and so on more as something that might happen in the future, real autonomy, actually offloading work that is not perfectly described and so on, this is starting to become a reality. There's such a strong push now to take these things and not only be reactive, something that you chat with and so on, but actually tell them to go away and do real work. So autonomy and automation. And with that, of course, comes a little bit of integration. When these things start being developed and start talking to each other, asking each other to actually perform tasks and so on, we're going to see a completely new ecosystem. So that's where we're also going to talk a little bit about this towards autonomy part. It's super exciting, and I think it might actually go quicker than many people expect. And if we then look at these things, so many really, really potentially useful AI services and such out there, of course, that comes with a lot of challenges. So how do we actually build these generative AI and foundational model applications in a responsible way to make sure that we actually don't introduce not only small problems in each service, but problems when we connect all of these things together, basically. And we can also see right now that we live in a world that is, in a sense, perhaps even a little bit darker than it was just a few years ago. We have wars throughout the world, conflicts that are physical, where AI is starting to be used at scale. We see threat actors in cybersecurity starting to use these tools more and more, not creating completely new capabilities perhaps, but definitely enhancing capabilities that really already exist. So of course, we're also going to have to look at what can we use AI for as defenders, with the additional interesting sort of problem or additional complexity of, these AI models can themselves also potentially be compromised or be used to compromise other systems. So all of the aspect of trustworthiness, security, and safety is, of course, also a super interesting topic that will be really at the forefront for the next, not only 12 months, but probably much longer than that. And still, I think that sort of the elephant in the room sometimes feel like when we're talking about these fantastic uses of AI, is that, okay, so how do we actually get economic value out of this? Where is it? How do we do it? Some of these things require investments in development and so on. I said that it's easier to develop now than it was before. Yeah, it is, but still, where do we put our bets in an AI sphere that basically moves so quickly that something I would have bet on, just a few weeks ago is being revised right now? And to actually get that real value out for all organizations, this is still a huge issue that I really do think requires some highlighting. So of course, this is also one of the topics. So that's a little bit why we chose these 4 topics for today. We can definitely come back with more topics in the future, but I think this is going to be super exciting today.
Thank you very much for that answer. And yes, we're really happy to hear your suggestions for future topics. However, today we have such a huge crowd and a packed agenda, so we do not have time for questions today, but feel free to reach out to AI Sweden in our channels or on LinkedIn. So now it's time for us to introduce the next speaker, which is Magnus Sahlgren, who is going to talk to us about open sourced large language models. And Magnus is from AI Sweden. Welcome, Magnus.
Thank you so much for the invitation. And I want to share some observations about the trend that I think is general in AI at the moment, but in particular in my field, which is large language models. The best way, I think, to visualize a trend is to talk about the development over time. So this is what we're going to do here. We're going to talk about the development of open models in contrast to closed models. And as you can see, I have the term open source there. So just a quick terminology note at first. We are not strictly speaking about open source in the traditional sense here. What we mean by open models is the ability to actually download models, to break them apart, to fine-tune them, to continue developing upon the models, and to integrate them into whatever experiments or services or products that we are building. And that is in contrast to closed models, where we cannot access the models themselves. And instead, we have to communicate with the models through an API, for example, or simply the models are not accessible. Also, I will be focusing on large generative language models, since this is what is interesting to me, and I have a feeling to the rest of the world also at the moment. So we will be focusing on large generative language models over time. We can say that this development really took off back in 2019. And now don't worry if you cannot read the acronyms or the names on these small boxes. That's not what is important. It's the size and number of boxes that are important through this timeline. The first larger generative language model is typically considered to be GPT-2, which was released at the beginning of 2019. That was the first large generative language model with a parameter count over 1 billion. And it was not initially released as an open model. The arguments back then was that such a big model would be too powerful to be openly released because of potential misuse and harms that might result from use. That led to quite the frustration in the research community and at times a very animated and lively debate in the research community. And eventually, GPT-2 was released as an open model. So towards the end of the year, we actually saw a public release of GPT-2. And to my knowledge, there has been no harm or foul as a result of releasing GPT-2 openly. On the contrary, it has proven to be a very useful research artifact, and it has led to considerable scientific progress and development since then. So a year later, in the summer of 2020, we saw the publication of GPT-3 from OpenAI. And this was, in many ways, the beginning of the era of large language models, which we are currently enjoying so much. And we are in the middle of this era right now. This was the first model that was over 100 billion parameters, and also the first model that showed more general capacity, dealing with lots of different types of tasks without specific fine-tuning. So here in Sweden, we started to think about how could we be part of this development. And in 2021, we formed the Natural Language Understanding Research Group here at AI Sweden, and we actually built the first Swedish large language model already in 21. This was a Swedish-only model, and it was not very large by today's standards, around 3 billion parameters. And we never actually released it openly because it was a preliminary model. We made it more for development purposes and to sort of test the infrastructure that was available here in Sweden. In 22, then, we started to see some really interesting developments in the open domain with a number of models that approached the size of GPT-3. So we had one model called Bloom, which was a result of a large open research effort led by Hugging Face, among others, that resulted in the Bloom model that covered a wide variety of very interesting languages on the same size as GPT-3. There was also the OPT models from Meta and some other large models. Here in Sweden, we were developing the GPT-3 models, which are North Germanic models, which means that they cover all the North Germanic languages. So that means Swedish, Norwegian, Danish, Icelandic, and also Faroese. And we had the first versions of GPT-3 coming out, GPT-3, sorry, coming out already towards the early autumn of 22. And the first time that these models were actually accessible to the general public was at an art exhibition here in Stockholm, hosted by the Liljevalchs Art Exhibition Fair, where we built a chatbot that resembled a fictional character in Kazuo Ishiguro's novel Tara and the Sun. That was actually published before ChatGPT came out. And this is also where we started to see the current development with lots of powerful models and open models. And really in 2023, the trend really took off. And basically we saw Cambrian explosion of open models starting to happen here. And this is also where we started to work on the open release of our models. In our case, since we were the first national initiative to produce this type of resources, also the first LLMs that were available for a smaller language group, it was not obvious how to do this release in a responsible way. So organizationally, we opted for a two-step release cycle where we first released the models for research and evaluation purposes, and then towards the end of 23, our models actually became open source. If we look at the actual trend line, and this is what is important in my presentation over time, we can see that closed models, proprietary models, had a major development around 21, 22, and then the number of closed models have sort of leveled out. But by contrast, open models have really taken off from 23 onwards. And so my prediction for 24 is we are going to see a continued development in this domain. We should also note here that all of these boxes are foundation models. So that means that these models are pre-trained from scratch using data that has been collected by the developers themselves. So this also means that once you publish one of these foundation models, people can build on top of that and continue developing on top of the open models. And this is the development that we are currently seeing. So if we look at the amount of models being published on Hugging Face, which is the framework that we all use to publish our models and to download models, if we look at the case of GPT-3, there are currently more than 60 models available at the Hugging Face repository with GPT-3 in the name. Most of them are produced by us from AI Sweden, but there are also other models that have been fine-tuned and modified by either other people. If we look at the more popular international models, Mistral, which has been one of the most popular models during the last couple of months, there are more than 6,000 models that have been a derivative of the original Mistral model. And for Llama 2, there are more than 12,000 models. So each of these foundation models that are being published openly, they will also spawn a potentially large number of offsprings. And this really fosters creativity, it fosters understanding, transparency, and development in this field. So this is my last slide. Why do we see this development? So I think there are a number of enablers that we can point to. So first of all, we now have access to big and open data sets, and that's really important for open development. I cannot stress enough how important open and accessible data sets are. Most of the data sets used in open model development are derivatives of Common Crawl in various different ways. So Common Crawl is a large initiative to crawl the web and make it accessible for all of us. And that is typically the basic foundation that model developers use. Also, we also have access to usable and efficient compute frameworks for actually training and deploying models. One of the more important frameworks that we all use for experimentation and development is Hugging Face transformers. When it comes to large-scale training, there are various other types of frameworks. We here at AI Sweden, we develop in conjunction with Fraunhofer a framework called Modalities for large-scale training. If you want to do development on your own laptop and use models locally, there are frameworks for that also. And all of this fosters this open development. And lastly, of course, we now have accessible compute for both for training models and also for using them. So in the case of actually training foundation models, we have wonderful resources here in Europe, in the EuroHPC infrastructure, where we can apply for access to large GPU clusters and train our models. And if you want to run your models locally on basically a laptop, you can do that by using consumer-grade graphics cards. So all of this contributes to the open development that we are seeing and that we will continue seeing going forward 24. And I will stop there.
Thank you very much, Magnus. So AI Sweden made a bet early on large language models. But Daniel, were you surprised at the effect that ChatGPT had when it came out?
A little bit. I think it's difficult to not be at least a little bit surprised, not in the capacity and the fact that it was possible to actually build such a model, but the effect that it had on both the community, as Magnus was saying, so many things came out after that led to open development and so quick innovation. And for us at AI Sweden, it's the question of, is AI important, basically disappeared overnight. And that was a massive change.
Thank you. So now we're going to move on and we're going to be listening to Sasha Rubel, who is the head of AI public policy for Europe, Middle East and Africa. And she works at AWS. I'm sorry if our image isn't showing, we're working on it, but Sasha, go ahead and tell us about AI safety and security.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. And really excited to follow Magnus's brilliant presentation, because I think he articulated very clearly two convictions that we have at AWS in terms of barriers to AI adoption. The first is really looking at democratizing access to innovation. And we do see that open source plays a really important role in democratizing access. And some of the counterparts that you talked about, and LLMs like Llama or Mistral or Hugging Face, are run off of AWS. And I'm happy to kind of shift to the second aspect that we see as a barrier to AI adoption, which is looking at understandings with regards to safety and security as it concerns the breakneck speed of development, as you mentioned in the beginning, Daniel, of generative AI. So one of the things that we are convinced of, let's see if there we are, that we are convinced of at AWS is that responsibility drives trust. Trust drives adoption, and adoption drives innovation. But this lack of understanding of how to develop and deploy and operationalize principles for responsible AI with the breakneck development of generative AI, we see as really one of the biggest barriers, and is also one of the areas that we're particularly focused on at AWS. So there's a lot of fear around generative AI and how quickly that it's developed, and I'll talk about that in just a minute in terms of the security dimensions. But one of the things that we see on a daily basis with the startups that we're supporting at AWS is that generative AI can be an extraordinary force for good, including addressing some of the challenges related to safety and security. So this goes from addressing and identifying cybersecurity challenges to really contributing in a very concrete way to addressing some of the challenges that we have with regards to sustainable development. So we see our customers working to accelerate drug discovery, mitigate climate change, ensure energy efficiency, which is really some of the biggest challenges facing us at a global level today. But we also see a lot of concerns being raised as it concerns the use of generative AI more broadly. So in a study that we just released on February 1st, one of the things that really struck me in terms of feedback from both Swedish businesses and citizens is that nearly 73% of Swedish people voiced concerns about AI. A lot of those concerns were about AI and the future of work, but 44% of Swedish respondents really underlined that their fears are based on a lack of transparency about how these systems make decisions. And this is where responsible AI, and particularly safety and security, comes into play. If we want to encourage AI adoption and innovation, which will transform, and I know another colleague will be talking about it in a little bit, the economy of Sweden, we really need to make sure that transparency and responsibility isn't an afterthought, but rather embedded across the life cycle of the development of generative AI. So first of all, what is responsible AI, and how do we think about that? At AWS, we really consider 6 key dimensions of responsible AI, and those are fairness, explainability, robustness, privacy and security, governance, and transparency. The transparency piece, especially through what we call our model AI service cards, is particularly important because businesses and citizens want to understand what kind of data was this large language model trained on? How is that data being used? How can these be deployed in specific use cases, and what kinds of considerations should be taken on board, not only because of the EU AI Act, when these large language models are deployed in what would be called high-risk use cases. And this is really central in terms of the way in which we think about responsible AI. A lot of our attention has gone to translating these principles into practice. I don't think anybody on this call today will look at these 6 principles and say, that's not really that important. There's general consensus that these ideas and principles should be integrated into the ways in which we design, develop, and deploy AI systems. But the question is, what do these principles mean to, for example, a back-end engineer that's developing or fine-tuning a large language model? So our focus has really been about translating these principles into operational guidelines throughout the life cycle of responsible AI. At AWS, we've taken a people-centered approach where we really focus on education. And here I'd like to stress that it's not just about educating not only the people who are working with us or our customers, but also more broadly through our AI-ready commitment, the general public, about what is artificial intelligence and machine learning, because as human beings, what we don't understand, we're afraid of, but also educating citizens about just because it's technologically feasible doesn't mean we should necessarily build it. And that's a key point, and a lot of our courses are developed in order to really address what do we mean when we talk about fairness and bias? What do we mean when we talk about explainability and transparency? And we see that kind of education just as important as the technical education that accompanies it. The second piece that we're very committed to in terms of safety and security is building diverse teams. So I'm an anthropologist by training, and a huge part of my job is saying, look, the only way you can address issues related to societal impact, to security threats, to safety issues, is if you bring together anthropologists, philosophers, ethicists, computer scientists, and engineers together to really address some of the emerging issues that are developing just as quickly as the technology. The third dimension is really taking a holistic approach. One of the things that we're committed to at AWS is to say, responsibility is not the responsibility of one team. It's the responsibility of all teams across the board, from design to development and deployment. And the last dimension is really engaging with multi-stakeholder organizations like the OECD, like the Global Partnership on AI, like the UN, to really think through some of the emerging challenges that are coming up with this technology focused on safety and security that I'll talk about in just a second. One of the other issues that came out of this study that we undertook in Sweden and a couple of other EU countries is that the lack of digital skills of the general public is really one of the biggest barriers for AI adoption. So really just want to put a call out there to the 630 plus people on this call to really focus on upskilling teams. And part of our AI Ready commitment is a platform with massive open online courses. There are more than 80 of them dedicated to upskilling citizens so that they're ready also for the work of tomorrow. My 18-year-old daughter wants to be a prompt engineer. When I was in college, without telling all of you how old I am, prompt engineer as a career didn't even exist. And if you said that, people would be like, what are you talking about? And so the idea is really not only about equipping young people, but also about equipping people who are already in the job market so that they are prepared not to be replaced by AI, but to work with AI. So we see in terms of safety and security, I would say 4 key challenges that we're trying to address, both internally as a company, but also working with policymakers. The first is what we call fidelity, so hallucinations. If you use a specific large language model that I will not name, and you ask, who is Sasha Rubel? I am a professional chess coach. I am a man who doubles as a Russian spy. And so these kinds of hallucinations, in terms of misinformation, particularly in this year of elections across the world, is really at the top of mind of policymakers everywhere. But we also see the opportunity for generative AI to be used to address misinformation, and I'll be talking about that in just a minute. The second piece that we see is toxicity and safety as a challenge coming up. So hate speech that is being propagated online, that because of the scale of generative AI, can be circulated with a speed and a rapidity that we have never seen before. And again, that's something that we see is also a policy challenge in terms of safety and security. Third is the question of intellectual property. And this is something that's front of mind for countries around the world as they grapple with thinking through how do we deal with, for example, AI and copyright, when in order to develop a large language model, for example, in Swedish, that is of quality, you need to be able to have access to quality documentation online in the Swedish language in order to develop a quality local LLM champion. So this is a third kind of area that we see in terms of safety and security. And the last is data privacy. How can we address risks related to personal data processing that find their way into the development of large language models used, again, at the national, but also international level? And there's a QR code there. I invite you to kind of check out some of the thinking that we've done around this, because one of the commitments that we have is really to focus on working with scientists to identify these risks, and then also looking at how we can use AI as a technology to mitigate and address the risks across the board that continue to emerge. So we really have 4 key pillars that I've mentioned in terms of how we think about responsible AI, moving from theory to practice, integrating responsible AI across the entire life cycle, prioritizing education, and ensuring that we are investing in science. As I mentioned, one of the things that we're particularly committed to is making sure that this kind of responsibility starts from the beginning in the ways in which we acquire training data and goes across the board from developing foundation models to post-process outputs to evaluations that we encourage in a format that we call red teaming, which is one of the key ways in which we continue to do adversarial testing to address safety and security concerns of our large language models and the large language models whose development we are supporting at the national and regional levels. So I want to talk very briefly about how we're actually using AI to address safety and security concerns and the ways in which we think about developing our large language models. The first is a tool that we have. It's a generative AI service called Amazon Code Whisperer, which has embedded in the service the possibility to have built-in security scanning, which immediately identifies, detects, and mitigates hard-to-detect vulnerabilities. The second service that we have, which is actually a foundation model called Amazon Titan, has a built-in capacity using artificial intelligence to detect and remove harmful content and data. So again, generative AI is giving rise to new safety and security concerns, but also is a possibility as a technology to address some of the concerns in the technology itself. The other dimension that we really focus on is making sure that we can ensure encrypted data and also privacy by design, which more and more, and coupled with quantum computing, which is also developing at breakneck speed, becomes more and more important. So privacy and security from day one, similarly to the ways in which we approach responsibility by design. One of the ways in which we've really focused on addressing safety and security concerns at the global level is by participating in conversations that bring together industry, civil society, and policymakers to say, what are the concerns and what needs to be done in order to address them? One of those examples is the White House voluntary commitments, which we signed on to last July alongside many other private sector partners, which then also gave rise to what is called the G7 Code of Conduct that we expect to continue to scale in terms of its operationalization beyond the G7 countries. Of course, in parallel, this is the EU AI Act and requirements for foundation models that reflect a lot of these commitments, including security risk information, mechanisms to detect if audiovisual content is AI generated, and also cybersecurity and insider threat red teaming. I want to very briefly touch on the fact that one of the things that we've done to operationalize these commitments is developing a system for watermarking of audiovisual generated content using generative AI to really address one of the top concerns in EU and beyond, which is the question of misinformation and deep fakes. So looking forward to working with AI Sweden and many others who are on this call today to continue to think through what are the state-of-the-art solutions that need to be addressed using AI in order to address what I'm sure will be continued safety and security questions that will continue to grow alongside the ways in which this technology is continuing to grow. And then I would just close by saying that we have a commitment really to say that there are really 6 dimensions that need to continue to be centralized in the ways in which we think about this technology. And I would close by saying that you have to test, 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 that there isn't a moment where this stops, that this needs to be done in a multi-stakeholder fashion. And it's one of the reasons why we're very committed to continuing to work with the brilliant scientists at AI Sweden and beyond to think through how we can continue to innovate in the ways in which we red team to address safety and security concerns in large language models. And I'll stop there.
Thank you very much, Sasha. Thank you very much, Sasha. So, Daniel, one of the figures that Sasha presented was the lack of transparency, and that is a big issue in Sweden. What's your take on that?
Yeah, and I think a lot of people, when you ask people in Sweden that question today, is a little bit unsure about what are these models, what are these services, etc., etc. I think the only way to really build trust is to build services that respond to users' actual needs and make sure that we all of us that are part of developing these things actually think about this is what's going to be best for the user, best for the company, etc., etc. And then I think we actually have a very, very good development ground.
Thank you. Next up, I want to introduce to you Patrick Couch, who is an AI expert at Hewlett Packard Enterprise. And Patrick, you're going to talk to us about autonomy. Go ahead.
All right, so thank you for the introduction. I hope everybody can see my screen okay and hear my voice. I assume that is a yes. So autonomy, very interesting topic. And I was thinking of maybe starting this off with a focus on the actual word. So when we talk about autonomy or towards autonomy, I think we really need to be careful here so as to not go astray. And one way to think of autonomy is to think about autonomy as referring to the ability to make decisions and act independently without external influence or control. It is often associated with individual freedom and self-determination. And in this aspect, or in this way of defining autonomy, I do not think that that's the trend we're seeing. I don't see a linear trend towards autonomy defined like this. But if we think about autonomy along the lines of agency, and we think about what is actually, what's the difference between agency and autonomy, because every now and then they will be used interchangeably. We can make note of what the Content Authority points out, that agency refers to the capacity to act and make changes in the surrounding world. Agency recognizes that decisions and actions are not made in a vacuum. Rather, they are influenced by surrounding systems and structures. And I think this is truly what we're seeing. We're seeing a trend towards ever increasing levels of agency. So in order to sort of get a grasp of where we're going in the universe in terms of this trend, I think it's worthwhile to sort of consider what Marshall McLuhan said about our state of affairs. And he basically said, we've turned the world into a global village. And he said this back in the 50s. And I guess some people understood him then, but I think it was very hard to understand what that really meant operationally. But today, with a global internet, I think it's pretty clear that we do live in this, to the extent that we are part of the internet or have access to the internet. I think it does make sense to think about our situation as one of a global village. It's just that it's a digital global village. And with this way of looking out into the world, we can see how the trend of autonomy or agency really comes into play and what is at stake. So another thing that I think is worth thinking about is something that Terence McKenna really articulated very well. And he said, the primary contribution of 20th century thinking is to have understood that information is primary. The world is made of language. And the implications for the digerati is that reality can therefore be hacked. And I think this is very astute, because I think if you think of code, if you think of the digital dimension, that's language, right? Those are just words. Those are ones and zeros. It's information. And we can push that around, hacking that digital world to do or to have it present to us what we want. And I think this is what we're seeing in terms of the bots, the agents, the assistants, and the rest of it. So I don't really think we're seeing a trend towards the descent or the emergence of a singular artificially generally intelligent entity. Rather, I think of this trend as the resurgence and the revenge of the office assistant. I think that the Microsoft Clippy thing was a precursor to something that we are now seeing to be much more influential, and its influence has grown in parallel to the relevance of the digital world. So when Clippy was roaming around in Microsoft Office, it was confined to that space. But if you look at something like Alexa or Siri, we can see that, okay, no, well, actually, these agents allow us, the humans, to actually impact the digital world. You know, set the timer for the boiling of the egg, play the Spotify playlist. So that's more impressive than what Clippy was doing back in the early 90s. But today, of course, we're seeing these amazing breakthroughs and conceptualizations and impacts that Copilot and Gemini are having. We're seeing these multimodal models, multi-agent systems, and they are radically changing things up. And when OpenAI had their dev day a couple of months back, and they announced the GPTs, and they announced the coming of the GPT store, that was all amazing. But what's perhaps even more interesting from a where are we going in the universe perspective was the announcement of the Assistants API. Because basically, in essence, what that allows you to do is to interconnect a number of these GPTs or agents, if you will. And of course, Microsoft is aboard that train as well, having released the AutoGen framework a couple of months back. And that is, in essence, a multi-agent framework, right? That's a framework to start having different agents interacting and interoperate with each other. So if you think about the progress or the linear evolution of the capabilities of artificial intelligence in some way, you can say that it has mastered rules. So back in the mid-90s, it mastered chess. In 2011, artificial intelligence showed to be really good at understanding natural language when IBM brought out Watson playing Jeopardy. We saw the breakthrough of confined exploration when DeepMind brought out AlphaGo, especially AlphaGo Zero, when they leveraged reinforcement learning to great effect. We've seen OpenAI show that actually algorithms can collaborate. So they can team up for a greater goal, and they can outplay teams of humans simply by being more proficient at collaboration. We saw when Google Duplex was announced how well artificial intelligence has mastered human language, and the voice, the tone, not just the language itself, but the actual speech showed to be very well represented technologically. And we also saw when IBM brought out Project Debater that in fact neural networks can very well reason given the correct priming, if you will. So if you bring all of this together, all of these capabilities, you master all of these capabilities, you master the large language models, you put that to work, and you put that and you release it as an application or a device, if you will, you get something like the Rabbit R1 device, which is basically your handy in pocket connection to the digital world, and you can have that then execute on your behalf in digital space. So it will basically be your agent out in tech space. And I think the announcement that was leaked or by the information last week, where it stated that OpenAI shifts AI background to software that operates devices, automates tasks, sort of shows you that, yes, this is in fact a true trend. This is where we're going. We're going to a sort of, if not autonomous, but then at least an empowered agency that can operate devices and automate tasks. And if you recall the great 80s movie Real Genius, there's this fantastic scene in the movie where our hero comes to the lecture hall and he realizes that all the other geniuses at this genius high has basically just dumped their tape recorders there, because why listen to a unilateral lecturer? And eventually the lecturer himself, the professor, realizes, well, screw this, and he puts his tape recorder there as well. And I think this is a great image of where the internet or where digital space is going. It is becoming more and more a space for bots, by bots, and very little a human place. It was a human place initially, perhaps, or the idea of the internet as a human place was perhaps articulated by John Barlow in the Cyberspace Manifesto, but it hasn't really come to fruition, right? And now I think we're sort of just cruising past that, and we're standing something completely different up. So we no longer sort of have to figure out who's behind the screen, like who's behind the curtain, am I interacting with a bot or not? What about the reCAPTCHA tests? I am not a robot. All of these insecurities will sort of be shot past once we get these AI assistants or AI agents to sort of act on our behalf, because they can roam around in that internet space and we can go do something else. So basically, we're sort of, in some ways, the trend is that we're moving towards the end of the internet, if you recall this old web page from way back. And the great thing with that is we can sort of return to the world, like Phileas Fogg, traveling the world in 80 days. The great thing with this story is that he has, of course, his trusted assistant, Passepartout, the guy who can sort of travel anywhere. He's the handy agent, the assistant, the valet that helps Phileas, navigate the world. And I think this is where we're going. We're going towards a situation where we're figuring out a way to have technology assist us interacting with technology so we can interact with humans in the world. And to end, I think Terence McKenna was very correct when he remarked that intelligence is what we have to make the forward escape into hyperspace or the future. We're not going to have a sustainable future with less intelligence. We need more intelligence. And I think the agents and empowering them and sort of having them act on our behalf, maybe not autonomously, but at least in some shape or form on our behalf as an autonomous agent, is where we're heading for sure. So with that, I think I say thank you.
Thank you very much, Patrick, for those insights. So Daniel, do you think Clippy is going to come back stronger?
Yeah, well, in a sense, I guess so. Yeah, we can already see it with all these assistants and so on being built into products. But I mean, what I'm excited about is the fact that all of these Clippies, so to speak, have enormous potential capabilities of digging out information, knowledge, interacting with other systems, and what also Patrick was talking about. Clippy didn't really talk to any other Clippies, but soon we will see these systems talk to each other.
I'm looking forward to that. Next up today, we have Gardar, Björnsson, Rova from McKinsey company, and Gardar is the global leader of QuantumBlack for investors. And I'm really looking forward to hearing Gardar talk about AI and economics. The floor is yours.
Thank you, and thanks for that introduction. Great to be with you guys, and sort of great work that everyone is doing at AI Sweden as well. So happy to contribute a bit. And we've heard many interesting perspectives, I think, about what is happening on open source, where are we heading with these models. I will maybe take the boring role and talk a little bit about sort of what are the fundamental economics around this and how do we think about them. And sort of my day job is advising some of the world's largest investors in AI on sort of how should they be thinking about their investment strategies, how should they be thinking about value creation in private capital portfolios and these types of things. So it will be hopefully quite a real perspective. Three things we'll talk about. Why, one, how does this impact the economy? Like, why does it impact the economy? Two, and we have a bit of AI going on here in the background. Two, what are the economic implications? So how big is it actually? How quickly will it go? And three, what does it do to the labor market, and where does it go? And looking forward to discussion on this as well later. The physics of the problem is sort of, what has actually happened in the last 2 years or so that means we're talking about this so much? Well, the fundamental thing that has happened is that we've seen an acceleration in the capabilities of AI models on many of the sort of human tasks. And I'll just call out here, coordinating between agents, creativity, reasoning, and problem solving, which are tasks that we thought would be automatable across the economy between 2030 to 2050, roughly, many of them 2050. Most of these have, or the ones I called out now, have accelerated by 15, 20, 25 years. So we're seeing a rapid acceleration in the capabilities that AI brings. What does that mean? Well, it means that we are going towards something that is a shift in the computer economy. So we've seen several platform eras in the computer economy, the internet being probably the most famous platform, mobile cloud social. Internet brought marginal cost of distribution to zero. Mobile cloud social brought sort of access cost to that almost to zero into everyone's pocket. And what we're now seeing is something that is sort of shifting the marginal cost of intelligence, at least many types of intelligence and many types of the tasks that human beings are doing, down towards zero. So that's sort of the fundamental shift. Then, we see now a value chain that is sort of being created across the world to support this part of the economy. I'll go through this very quickly, but just to give us a sense of, okay, who is empowering this shift? What's happening? We think there's a roughly 200 to 300 billion USD market that is sort of emerging around generative AI technologies. So far, we've seen about 20 billion started to be spent, mostly in the US or sort of other parts than in Europe. And it's basically supported by, your cloud platforms, your hardware providers, and then as we talked about with frontier model providers of a bit more closed source models, example, OpenAI, Anthropic, and then specialized model providers that are starting to emerge within this space. And that supports probably the largest value pool around horizontal and vertical software applications, where most of them are still in development. So that's the sort of $200 to $300 billion software market that comes out of this, which is the biggest sort of market shift. But what does it do to the economy? So in terms of the economy, we think this is roughly the productivity value when we break down what are the tasks that can be automated using this technology, what are the use cases for how to automate in this technology. The productivity value when we get full implementation of those is in the range of 6 to 8 trillion USD. So it's about 6 to 8% of the global economy, Germany and UK combined, roughly in terms of GDP. That's a massive productivity value. We should understand that productivity value will take a long time to accrue. So it's not happening in 1 year, 2 years. We think this is more maybe a 15, 20-year horizon until much of this value is being captured. So we should always just keep, and this is the same with the internet. Like, everyone was very excited about the internet. It took actually, a couple of decades before it truly transformed the economy. If we look at Sweden, and we've run the numbers on Sweden, where does this happen? Like, what are the big functions where this happens? One thing is, we think overall it is sort of a potential of 180 billion roughly in Sweden. Overall, the major potential is in software development, technology development, those types of companies. We've already seen large-scale implementation of these models in those companies, especially on the US side, but starting to come also towards Europe. the complete marketing and sales function, everything from the creative, the copywriting to end-to-end sales flows in B2B sales, automation, and these types of things. And then there's actually quite a significant chunk also in industrial use cases, where we see now more and more automation of supply chain functions, procurement type of functions, claims management, and these types of use cases that are not the first one that people think about when they think about generative AI. But when you go into an industrial company, there are thousands of people working on these types of problems. So that is a little bit breaking down, okay, roughly where does the value come from when we talk about these things. And then I'll go to what are the labor implications of this? So what happens then in the labor market? We've said it's a platform shift in the economy. There's 6 to 8 trillion USD that is being created across the global economy. It comes from a couple of the clear functions that we now saw. And this chart basically shows you the different estimations that we've been doing. And we've, in McKinsey and QuantumBlack, we've been working on since 2017, our methodology for how to measure the pace of automation across the economy. We started with our sort of first estimates of 2017. We've been tracking that estimate. So far, we've been slightly under. And at that point, we said, well, the midpoint for when we think roughly half of all the tasks that are being performed across the economy on Earth will be automated would be around the 2050 mark or something like that. And we still see quite a wide variety of outcomes here, because it's sort of all up to do with how quickly do software companies create solutions, how quickly do other companies implement those solutions, how do our regulators move. Our midpoint scenario has now shifted 10 years closer in time. So we're now estimating roughly 2045 will be the point at which we've automated roughly half of the tasks that we're doing on Earth. Doesn't mean all the humans don't do anything with half of their time. We'll get back to that. But that's sort of the adoption curve that we are on. If we are really fast in this shift, we would rather be to the left of this chart. So then it is more of a 1 decade type of transformation, which I think is the case in high wage economies and industries with sort of very high costs associated to things that are automatable will be earlier on this automation curve. What generative AI does in this is it very much increases the automation potential on things like using expertise, doing administration, interacting with stakeholders. It doesn't do so much with the predictable physical work and these types of things that previous generations of automation have much more addressed. So we're seeing something like a almost tripling of the automation potential of things like doing decision making, planning, creative tasks, and these types of things. And if we look at Sweden again, and we'll try to sort of zoom into the country that we're talking about now, then if you order all the occupations in Sweden in size, which we've done on this chart here, if you take together the 5 first professions, all of those actually have quite significant increases in automation from generative AI. So in healthcare professionals, it's about 10%. In business and legal professions, we actually move towards a 60-70% automation potential of what's being done there. Office support tasks, we already had 70% automation potential from them. Doesn't mean all that gets realized. We move up towards a 90% automation potential. So those are some examples of, and this is about 2.5 million people in Sweden working in these types of jobs where there will be significant shift in what happens in the economy. But before we get completely freaked out with this is going to be very big and change the lives of many, we've seen these shifts in the economy before. Typically, when we look back in history on everything from, as we're seeing here, the sort of shift from agriculture society towards industrial society, but also the advent of computing, we've typically had more employment, we've had higher prosperity, and we've had sort of lower working time for humans. So we work less, we earn more. And what you see here is sort of a shift from a 70-80% agricultural society to like a 1-2% agricultural society that has happened since 1850. And what's happened is most people on Earth are much better off. And we expect this is the similar type of transition that will happen in the economy now. So that's to not scare everyone too much. This will actually probably lead to good things that are happening in the economy. So in summary, we've gone through very much content now, but I'll give you the highlights again. Generative AI accelerates the development, the capabilities by 10 to 30% and the automation by roughly 10 years. massive economic implications, 6 to 8 trillion, but it happens over a longer time period than most people would have you believe. This is a lot of automation within the workforce, mostly of white collar type of work that is added, but it does mean that we will see new things being performed in the economy, and humans will shift into things that these models are not doing so well. So that's all for the messages. Now look forward to the discussion later. I think we're going to talk more about these things in a bit. But thanks for giving the attention now.
Thank you very much, Gardar, for all those interesting statistics. So the time has come now for the little fireside chat. And I would like to invite all the panel participants and the speakers back. And while we wait for you to come back, I want to start directing a question to you, Gardar. And I mean, you work a lot with large corporations such as bank and so on, who have already done a lot of automation. And now we saw already that half of tasks might be automated already by 2045. But how far are we from trustworthy systems?
Yeah, I mean, there is much debate on this, and I think sort of on a general, any system in the world being trustworthy, there's still sort of a gap. But we do work with financial institutions, healthcare institutions, insurers to actually build systems that are trustworthy. And when we do these projects with large institutions, 70-80% of the time that we spend so far goes with the risk department, the legal, the compliance people, to build in the right safeguards and guardrails around them. And I think, someone here mentioned hallucinations earlier, which is absolutely a real issue if you take a raw model and you try to do something with it. But what's been developing over the last year is a series of ways to address those types of risks. And we are now at the point where we are productionizing, even in regulated industries such as financial services or banking, we are productionizing one-to-one hyper-personalized messages across millions of customers that we are comfortable enough sending to those customers, and they will not do any monkey business.
Thank you. And how about you, Sasha? How far do you think we are from trustworthy systems, and perhaps in which sector is it going to come first?
So I'll start for the last part of that question, which is in which sector will it come first, to say I couldn't agree more with Gardar. I think the regulated industries is really a priority area, particularly the health sector and the financial sector. They're also typically early adopters of AI. So I think that's a specific focus area, specifically when you think about the possible deployment of AI in high-risk use cases. And what are those high-risk use cases? They're around questions related to personal health and safety, questions related to human rights, and where we see those at stake, most notably, is in the regulated industries. So that's an area where I see AI being an early adopter, and also a lot of work being done on the questions of trustworthiness and responsibility. How close are we to trustworthiness? I would say, very frankly, I don't think that work is ever going to end. I think that the technology is going to continue to develop. And in the ways in which it develops, there will be emerging challenges. And we are going to have to continue to work together across stakeholder groups to address the challenges that continue to arise. Are we going to arrive at a point when we say, all our issues are solved and there is no problem with technology? I don't think so. I think what we are going to have to do is continue to invest in the science around responsible AI as it continues to evolve, and continue to invest in the education of civil society in terms of what it means to develop and design and deploy these technologies responsibly.
Thank you. So I would also like to touch upon the public sector, because that's just such an important part of building a prosperous society. So I want to start with you, Daniel. When do you think we can see an effect of AI on the public sector?
Oh, when I think we can see it, or when I hope we can see it?
Why not both?
Yeah. So I hope we can really start seeing real useful effects within a year or two. I mean, it takes a little bit to develop these things. We can't, within the public sector, run as fast as we do, for example, as we do at a private company or something like that. We already have, as Gardar mentioned, some technologies to build these trustworthy systems based on these technologies. So the use is there. The processes are a little bit slower, so let's give it 2 years. I would really hope that we had it done within 6 months, but that's probably not going to happen.
Would you guys agree? Anyone against? All smiles.
I would say, I would just say that's an optimistic timeline, to be honest. But I think it's not like a black and white. It gets done or it gets doesn't get done. So can we have 10% implementation in 1 or 2 years, and that's actually going to be quite a lot of impact? I probably agree. Before we actually get a transformation of the healthcare sector, is probably more 15 years.
So
Likely, yes.
Can I add something here?
Of course.
So I think it's worth keeping in mind that in Sweden, the public sector were basically the earliest adopters of the modern type of language models. So we started the project called Language Models for Swedish Authorities already back in 2019, which was before GPT-3, started to look at use cases in the public sector. And my impression is that the Swedish public sector has been early adopters of these techniques. And I know there are several government authorities that are looking into the use of LLMs right now. So we have the Swedish Tax Agency, for example, the Swedish Unemployment Agency, etc. And we are, of course, also running an initiative here at AI Sweden now, building a digital assistant for the public sector, which focuses more on the sort of frameworks and the structure around building these agents rather than actually implementing like a chat GPT for Sweden. But essentially, our focus is public sector mainly.
Very good. And now that we're talking to you, Magnus, I actually wanted to ask you about the public sector and open source. What do you think the benefits and detriments of using open source in the public sectors are?
Yeah, so one of the main discussions that we have here in Sweden when it comes to adoption of LLMs is the fear of sending data through an API, basically across the borders of Sweden. That's typically not possible in many cases. For example, in the Swedish health sector, you need to run models locally. So that's a big case for having local models. A lot of actors also want to fine-tune and continue developing on models. So you need to be able to provide the basic resources for further development. And open models is a prerequisite for that, and that will foster uptake. I'm not at all against having really powerful and good commercial models. That's a complement, but in certain cases, you really need to have open source models.
Thank you. And I was really interested by the statistic we saw about how all roles are going to change. And I would like to ask you a little bit about what roles do you think we're going to see more of in the future? And this is, of course, going to be a complete shot in the dark. But Patrick, what if we don't have 50% of the tasks that we have right now? What are we going to do instead?
Well, so I would love to see something like a universal basic income scheme actually put in place to good use and actually work so as to free up non-labor, because I think we've been shortchanged a bit, and I think the human mind is a fantastic tool, but it should really be put to more creative use. And I think most of us wouldn't mind having some of the tasks that we spend hours on during the week to have automated and just done away with. Now, I don't think this will happen. I think rather that's what we want, but what will happen is we will just be given other tasks, and then we will be doing that. Hopefully, though, there will be like a level change or a step change in terms of the nature or the character of those tasks. So they will perhaps then be more human. I mean, I think of repetitive tasks as inhuman and inhumane, and I think they cause a lot of physical damage, like just sitting still in front of a computer all day typing away at the keyboard, or being at the cashier at the grocery store moving goods with a barcode across a laser beam. I think those are just not suitable for humans. We should do something completely different. But I think this will be tied into those like economic upsides or benefits that we can see start emerging as our technology starts to be more capable of doing some of these tasks that we don't want to do. And once we see value or actual monetary gains from an optimization of those tasks, then I think we will open up the conversation for, okay, but what should we do with that additional time? So I think and this is something for Gardar, I guess, to sort of ponder about, but just like the macroeconomic implications of being able to produce goods and services without human intervention through some sort of autonomy, I think is very exciting. I mean, you would want to have stated that, oh, but when the spinning jenny came along, all the textile workers in Britain became poets and artists. And that didn't happen, of course. We got the Industrial Revolution and people were just stuck in horrible urban environments. So that didn't work out. But then you sort of, you overcome that and you work it through, and then things change. And very few people in Britain now sit spinning, stuff. So it's an ever-evolving landscape. And I think we should all be open-minded and sort of be willing to think outside of that box and really think, the way things are now aren't necessarily, they don't really need to be like this. Honestly, we could just change it we change it, we just have an agreement, and then all of a sudden, we just no defense if we want no defense, or you pick something. And that's the great power of the human collaborative effort, right? So I think we need to be, we need to be sort of thinking about what technology can take us and not be afraid.
Thank you very much. I think that I saw a lot of nodding in the rest of the panel. I think there's much agreement. Is there anyone else who would like to add something? I felt like you looked like you wanted to say something, Sasha.
Was it because I was nodding so enthusiastically? Maybe just to complement what Patrick said, and I think, Patrick, you articulated it perfectly with a couple of statistics that I think are really pertinent in terms of where we see things going. As part of this survey that we did, which was specific to Sweden, but also EU-wide, we saw that 67% of businesses predicted that in 5 years' time, a candidate's digital skills would actually be more important than their university degree. And so when you're thinking around, what does that mean in terms of how we're thinking about the future of education? It also means that the focus will be not only on digital skills, but teaching people how to think and how to engage critically with tools like large language models. There's also, I think, and Patrick, you said it beautifully, in general, an emphasis on what we could potentially lose instead of what we could gain, including free time to think more critically about how we want to be using technology to contribute to the good of the world. And actually, one of the things that we found in this report that was published is that 50% of European citizens are actually confident that AI will create more opportunities than risks. And I think if you look at the history of the world, every technological revolution has led to more jobs. Have jobs changed? 100%, yes. But when you think about responsible AI and accountability, one of the principles is this idea of human oversight. So the doctor or the lawyer who is working with AI will replace the doctor or the lawyer who's not working with technology. And so the key there is thinking about, okay, well, how do you empower people in the workforce and young people with the capacity to engage critically with this technology? And again, that's where the question of responsibility, I think, really needs to play a very central role.
Gardar, it felt like you also had an addition.
Yeah, and I mean, I think we should also just it's very easy to get carried away and think, everything is going to transform, everyone is going to have new jobs or more free time. I think, I mean, what we're saying, or what I was saying before, is well, in Sweden, maybe we can have, for about 8 to 10 billion more worth of healthcare. It's how will we want to get that healthcare? Will we want to, get rid of all the nurses and doctors and have robots? I'm pretty sure that's not going to happen. So it is much more that we will actually much needed productivity increase as workforce changes, as population ages. This will be an amazing tool for us to increase the productivity, to be able to maintain the level of healthcare and even increase the quality of healthcare. But I don't think the job implications, other than the job day works, will be very significant. And when we look at, shift after shift in the history of technology, it has typically in that sector led to more jobs being created. So the net effect is typically positive. Then there are a few pockets of jobs that are heavily impacted. If we look at automation in industry, that was sort of workers on the sort of manufacturing line where there was lots. And we as a society, we need to think about reskilling. So how can we sort of reskill some of those individuals that are in those particular pockets of jobs where there will be significant automation? I think many, Sweden is one of the countries that is taking the most responsibility, both from the business and society side, in thinking through the questions on how do we do that reskilling. But overall, I think we should just be, amazingly happy that we can get, it's like we have a check of 180 billion, which we can just get more products, services, more healthcare, more education, better education for, which is great. So let's go for that.
Thank you. So the most important thing here is that we actually start adopting, right? So I think that's an important question. What is really needed for adoption? We're talking globally about a compute shortage, a GPU shortage. We're also talking a lot about trust lacking. What else do we need, or what does it take to actually adopt AI? Magnus, would you like to start?
I have a feeling that if anyone else on the panel would be better suited to answer this question. I'm more concerned on developing these tools. But yeah, I mean, adoption is of course key. I can't stress enough the importance of having hardware and infrastructure nationally to actually be able to use these type of systems. I mean, now there's a really strong current trend of making models more efficient, smaller, that you can run them locally, basically on a laptop. That's going to continue. But we are also going to see increased use cases of foundation models. And there we are going to need to have large infrastructure to actually host those models. And especially here in Sweden, this is something we are needing to put into place.
I think your colleague Daniel might want to add something to that topic.
Yeah, perhaps. I mean, what you said, Magnus, of course, that's definitely correct. And as long, I'm a true believer in, especially since working with a few companies actually applying these things and building real production systems. So if you start giving people access to these tools, developers and so on, they run much quicker than you might actually think. And they do reskill themselves to a very, very large degree. And I'm a really, really true believer in, making this useful to, an organization, a company, public sector, and so on, getting everybody involved and enthusiastic so that development basically happens everywhere. Because these are not as scary artifacts or things that you might think. These are more accessible than, than most people actually believe. So yeah, get it out there.
I totally agree with Daniel and also with Magnus. I really think that putting this technology in the hands of the many is the way to go. Lower thresholds, make sure that it's commercially viable to actually make use of them, that it's regulatory safe to use them, and then just try to seed as many kids as possible with technology and see what they make of it, because them brains are exciting, right? I do also agree with Magnus that we need to find both more clever ways to make use of all the infrastructure that is littered out there. I mean, if you look at the planet, how many, CPUs and UPUs and motherboards and the dits and the dats, bits and pieces of compute possibilities are out there, and how much are used in a clever way. That there's that world scientific grid thing that you can have your laptop, if it's idling, make use of, SETI can use it to look for extraterrestrial, whatever, right? There are many clever ways to think differently about usage of actual available hardware in some clever way, like sharing economies or what have you. But then also I think we need to realize that some of these scientific breakthroughs will also require a different kind of compute, like a supercompute, like a high performance compute. And previously, those sort of high performance computing clusters have been the privilege of the few. And that doesn't make for like a global inclusive research agenda along the lines of Magnus's open source thing, right? So we need to do a bunch of different things. But the most important thing is really just you and me and everybody, we just need to start playing around with this and see what it is. And that will itself then evolve into a momentum building thing. Yes, there are, of course, political initiatives that we should launch. I've been an ardent advocate of having Sweden become like a test bed for the world, because we're so few, we're so extreme, we're so still pretty cohesive as a nation, but we haven't really, teamed up around that. And this was clear in that event last week, the AI in the interest of the nation, because if you contrast how Sweden is going about it to how Estonia is doing it, Estonia is really the test bed thing. And they, of course, they're even fewer than us. So they have an even easier time, and they have a sort of slightly different geopolitical placement. But anyway, I think that approach is very instructive. I think we can learn a lot from that go-do attitude.
Patrick, if I can build on...
Let's go with Sasha first and then Gardar.
If I can build on your comment in terms of infrastructure, 100%, one of the key drivers of AI adoption we see is access to the cloud. That is the start and the end of this kind of innovation. But what we've seen in terms of a trend is that this kind of adoption is skewed much more to larger companies than SMEs. So it's 51% of larger companies are adopting the cloud versus 31% of SMEs. And so one of the things that we see is absolutely essential is really investing in the local startup ecosystems so that they are driving innovation. That's really one of the things that we see is absolutely essential. The second, obviously, and I won't go into it again, is the digital skills piece, investing in digital skills. But I do want to come back, Magnus, to what you were saying, is that it is absolutely essential that particularly small scale startups have clarity in terms of upcoming regulation and legal certainty with regards to what is being regulated and what is not, and how to comply with regulations like the EU AI Act, but also upcoming standards. And we've seen that that's actually one of the biggest barriers to AI adoption, is that 31% of businesses are saying that compliance and legal uncertainties in the EU are stopping them from investing in adopting digital technology. And they plan to invest 48% less in technologies over the next 3 years. So developing regulatory frameworks that provide the legal certainty necessary so that startups aren't saying, I'm not going to invest because I may not have the human, legal, or regulatory capacity to understand and comply. That kind of legal clarity at the national and regional level is absolutely essential in order to encourage AI adoption.
Thank you. Well said. Gardar.
Yeah, I mean, I'll agree on sort of having the clarity around sort of legal frameworks and everything. I would take a little bit of a different view actually to sort of, what is actually required, especially in the Nordics, and for me, working a lot, in the US and in Asia as well, what is the difference here and what are we not doing? I would say like experiments, pilots, letting innovation free in our organizations, we have coming out of our ears in the Nordics. There's so much of that is sort of organizations are doing. What they're not doing is like senior business leaders in Swedish companies and Swedish public organizations, don't understand what this technology can do, which is fine, but they're not educated in how do you transform a supply chain with AI? How do you transform service operations, if you're in the public sector with AI? They delegate that responsibility to sort of junior people in their IT departments and technology departments that don't have enough vision to be able to actually truly transform the business. And they believe that there is something called AI magic, which is sort of, I can invest, $1 million there, and I get, $1 billion out on the other side, which doesn't make sense. The business case for AI is often good, but it's not sort of a magic business case. So I think, what we actually need to do is, for especially Nordic business leaders to a little bit grow up and say, this is a transformative technology. There's significant potential to transform our business. We will not be competitive if we don't do it. So we need to learn and figure out how the heck we drive this transformation. We need to get the capabilities and we need to put proper investments behind it. And I see that happening all the time with like in US companies that I'm working with. There the CEO sits every week with the teams that are driving this transformation, asking like, where's the business value? How quickly will we get to it? But in the Nordics, it's still this AI magic myth going around.
Thank you. And I think that answers the question that Daniel sort of posed in the beginning of companies like, when should we invest? How long should we wait if the technology is going so fast? It's like now is the time, basically. So before we start wrapping up, I wanted to ask a question to each and every one of you. Now, we've talked about these 4 trends today that Daniel helped select. But if you were to talk a little bit about the future, what trends do you see coming up as well? Let's start with, I'm going to pick Magnus again.
Yeah, so I think one trend that has already, or 2 trends that have already been mentioned. So one is multimodality. That's an obvious one. We haven't really started to see that taking off in the open source community or the open source models. It will happen during this year, I'm pretty sure. Lots of people are working on it, including us. Also, agent-based systems is going to be a hot trend 24 onwards. A little bit more technical thing that I can just mention is also the current trend of not really just training models, but also just merging models. So you take a couple of pre-trained models and then you just combine them, like merging them actually into one new model. And that actually seems to work in a sort of magical way. So, and this is also just, it's an effect of us having these both compute frameworks, programming frameworks like Hugging Face and others, and also having open source models. So this type of creativity and innovation is only possible if we can actually release open foundation models. And we're going to see a lot more of that type of development going forward. It's going to be exciting.
Thank you. Gardar, would you like to go next?
Yeah, sure. And I always take that contrary negative view. I think actually what we'll see now is disillusionment for the next 6 months to 1 year, because I think everyone has been so excited about ChatGPT and all these types of things. They forgot that, this doesn't actually, it's not actually available in most of the software that you are using currently. Like, most software companies are building these features in now. They will be released during 2024. The first 1 or 2 iterations will probably be quite bad. So people will be surprised or sort of negatively surprised with how bad they are. So I think in the B2B world, there's going to be a little bit of this like, oh, we had so high expectations. Is this actually what we get? Before in sort of 25, 26, we actually get the sort of real acceleration behind it. On the consumer side, I'm probably more optimistic that we'll actually get a sort of series of new, customer experiences from our global tech giants, from tech startups that are driving, amazing consumer experiences. So in the consumer world, we'll have more rapid adoption, more stuff will happen on our phones, more stuff will happen around these types of headsets in the next couple of years. But then, year 3 and on is where business comes back and it's actually truly transformative.
Thank you. Let's head over to Sasha's take.
Great question, by the way. We see kind of 4 key trends coming up. One is the idea of small language models. We've been talking a lot about large language models, but I think more and more, building Magnus on what you were saying with multimodality, there will also be more and more fine-tuning to develop small language models, linked to a second trend I see, which is increased concern around carbon footprint of innovation. What does it mean to train and run inference of these models? And what does that do in the long term in terms of carbon footprint? And we see, for example, in the EU AI Act, environmental impact assessments as part of that regulation. And I think that's really going to become more and more front of mind. The third kind of trend that I see is that there really won't be one large language model to rule them all. There'll be thousands. And I think that there will be more and more concerns by countries to develop large language models that reflect their cultural values, and really, again, want to salute AI Sweden for being at the forefront of innovation on this, where countries will want a Swedish GPT or a Brit GPT, and local LLMs in local language to serve citizen needs, particularly to promote adoption by public services. And then lastly, I see a trend right now, even, for example, with the G7 Code of Conduct, of moving from regulatory approaches, like the EU AI Act, to multi-stakeholder approaches to develop codes of conduct, because the pace at which this technology is developing outpaces any regulatory framework or process that exists right now. So models that bring multilateral fora together with multi-stakeholder fora to think through these questions of trustworthiness, safety, and security, and how to develop voluntary codes of practice to ensure kind of compliance voluntarily beyond legislative approaches.
Thank you. Patrick, we're slowly running out of time, so I'm going to have to ask you to keep it short and sweet.
Yeah, I don't want to be last because I have such a bummer of an ending note. And I think the trend we're seeing is really the proliferation of deepfakes and what that does to trust on the internet. And I don't think it's going to be messy. And I think that we're entering into this decreased trust by the day. And I'm wondering, what does the machinations on the internet have? What is the impact on politics, for instance? The upcoming US election, the last time around was a show. It was not good, right? And this is going to be even worse. And I wonder, as we proliferate these wonderful, indistinguishable phenomena on the internet, how will that impact us? And the European Union AI Act has this very interesting formulation about unacceptable risk. And I quote, cognitive behavioral manipulation of people. That's unacceptable risk. But I ask you, what is political propaganda and what is advertising? And now we're in this, we can't go back, right? We just have to forward escape our way out of this. But I see this trend of this really messy, problematic misinformation, disinformation challenge. And we just have to sort of, become, like, it's like Marshall McLuhan said about there are no passengers on spaceship Earth. We're all crew. Like everybody needs to chip in.
I'm going to have to say
That's
thank
it.
you for that great quote. It's a bummer, but it's an important topic. So with 30 seconds left, Daniel,
Yes.
what is your main takeaway from today?
That I think that all of the stuff that we've been talking about today, all of the trends that we've actually mentioned here in the last few minutes, it's happening right now, and it's going way quicker than we can perhaps even possibly expect. A lot of the things we've been talking about right now are happening as we speak.
Thank you very much. Thank you so much to all the panelists, everybody who participated. If you want more information, I advise you to go to the AI Sweden webpage, ai.se, or visit our very good platform with lots of examples of use cases and education, my.ai.se. Thank you very much for today. Have a lovely evening.